How does a scam become sacred? Not just believed, not just defended, but wrapped in holy language, protected by religious authority, funded by desperate people, and then praised as faith. Because when most people hear prosperity gospel or word of faith, they think that this is just a Christian problem. It's not. This is a human problem wearing Christian clothes. This is what happens when magical thinking, financial desperation, social pressure, charismatic authority, and institutional power all meet in the same room. And once you understand how this machine works, you don't just understand televangelists. You understand cult leaders. You understand political movements, wellness scams. You understand manifestation culture, hustle gurus, crypto prophets. You understand every system that learns how to take human vulnerability, rename it belief, monetize it, and then blame the victim when the promise collapses. So today, we're using word of faith doctrine as the case study because this doctrine gives us one of the clearest examples of how hope can be weaponized when people are scared, broke, grieving, lonely, ambitious, desperate, or searching for meaning. We're not just unpacking bad theology, we're exposing a psychological machine, a system that learned how to dress greed up as faith, a system that learned how to call pressure obedience, a system that learned how to call exploitation sowing, a system that learned how to sell people the promise of control in a world that often feels uncontrollable. And then, when the harvest never comes, the system does what every successful manipulation system does. It protects itself by blaming the person it exploited. You didn't believe hard enough. You spoke the wrong words. You had too much doubt. You missed your season. You blocked your own blessing. But that's not just theology, that's psychology. That's social control. That's financial predation dressed in sacred language. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why prosperity preaching works, why intelligent people can still fall into it, why seed faith operates like religious gambling, and how to recognize the difference between genuine hope and a system trying to use your hope as leverage. Because the tragedy of word of faith doctrine is not merely that it takes people's money, it takes human hope, sells it back as a miracle, and then blames people when the miracle doesn't arrive. So let's talk about it. From manna to modern scams, from daily bread to hundredfold returns, from ancient provision stories to digital age prosperity influences. Let's talk about the psychology of the word of faith doctrine. The first thing we have to understand is that prosperity preaching didn't appear out of thin air. It grew out of a much older religious impulse, the desire to believe that material conditions can be changed without ordinary cause and effect. That's why stories like manna matter. Manna is not word of faith doctrine, but it does represent a powerful idea in the religious imagination, provision that bypasses the normal economy. No planting, no harvesting, no wages, no trade, no visible process, just need, divine favor, and supply. And once a culture accepts the idea that provision can arrive outside ordinary causal exchange, that idea can move in very different directions. In one context, it can become a story about survival, dependence, and having enough for the day. But in another context, it can become the foundation for something much more manipulative. The promise that if you perform the right spiritual action, speak the right words, obey the right leader, or give just the right seed, reality itself will bend in your favor. That's where word of faith becomes dangerous. It takes the ancient hope for supernatural provision and turns it into a system. It doesn't merely say God can provide, it says these are spiritual laws that can be activated. It turns faith into a mechanism, words into forces, giving into investment, and poverty into evidence that somebody failed to operate the system correctly. So the line from manna to modern scams is not a straight line of biblical corruption, it's a psychological evolution. Human beings have always wanted relief from uncertainty. We've always wanted some assurance that hunger, doubt, sickness, crisis, and instability are not the final word. But word of faith doctrine monetizes that desire. It takes the longing for unearned provision and turns it into a transaction. Give what you have, say what they tell you, silence your doubt, and wait for the supernatural return. And that's why the doctrine is so effective. It doesn't have to create the vulnerability. The vulnerability is already there. The fear is already there. The need is already there. The desire for life to break in your favor is already there. Word of faith simply gives that desire a formula, gives that formula a preacher, gives that preacher a platform, and then gives the platform a payment link. Once you understand that, positive confession starts to make more sense. Because if provision can bypass ordinary cause and effect, then language becomes the imagined tool for controlling that provision. That's where we move from manna falling from heaven to believers being taught that their words can make reality obey. The real question is not how could anyone believe this? That question is too easy, and honestly, it misses the point. The better question is what kind of system can make intelligent people ignore what they can clearly see? Because people don't fall into prosperity preaching because they lack intelligence. They fall into it because intelligence is not the same thing as immunity. You can be educated and still be grieving. You can be logical and still be scared. You can understand money and still feel desperate when the bills are due. You can be skeptical in one area of life and still vulnerable in another when the right promise touches the right pain. That's where the psychology matters. Prosperity preaching works because it creates a bypass around ordinary critical thinking. Instead of asking, does this actually work? The believer is trained to ask, am I doubting God? Instead of asking who benefits from this message, they're trained to ask, am I blocking my blessing? Instead of asking, why does the preacher always get richer while the congregation seems to keep struggling? They're trained to ask, do I have enough faith to receive? That's the trap. Spiritual language becomes a shield around exploitation. It protects the system from investigation by making investigation feel like rebellion, doubt, negativity, or disobedience. And once that happens, the person is no longer just evaluating a claim. They're fighting against shame, fear, belonging, identity, and the possibility that the thing they trusted may have been using them. So, this is not about mocking people who believed, it's about understanding the machinery that made belief feel necessary. Because once you can see how the system redirects questions, punishes doubt, rewards certainty, and blames the victim when the promise fails, you become harder to manipulate. And that's the point of the deep dive. We're not just asking whether prosperity preaching is true, we're asking how it works on the mind. How does it turn hope into leverage? How does it turn doubt into guilt? How does it turn giving into proof of obedience? How does it turn failure into the follower's fault? And how does it keep people emotionally invested even after the evidence keeps telling them the promise is not working? Because the scam is not only in the money people lose, the deeper scam is in the mental framework people inherit. A framework where reality is always negotiable, evidence is always secondary, the leader is always protected, the doctrine is always right, and the person who was harmed is always told to search themselves for the reason that it didn't work. The architecture of divine entitlement begins with a simple but dangerous shift. Faith stops being trust and becomes entitlement to control. Once people are taught that words can make reality obey, that belief can activate invisible laws, and that giving can force supernatural return, they're no longer just hoping for help. They're being trained to believe that the universe is supposed to respond to them. And to quote Neil deGrasse Tyson, the universe is under no obligation to make any sense to you. That's why Word of Faith is not merely about wanting money. It's about constructing a worldview where material success becomes the expected proof that reality is working correctly. Health is supposed to respond. Money is supposed to respond. Opportunity is supposed to respond. The body is supposed to respond. The market is supposed to respond. Other people are supposed to respond. And if something doesn't respond, the doctrine doesn't question the worldview, it questions the believer's technique. This is where entitlement becomes spiritualized. The person is not taught to say, I want more money. They're taught to say, I am believing God for increase. They're not taught to say, I'm dissatisfied with where my life is. They're taught to say, I'm stepping into my new season. They're not taught to say, I'm taking a financial risk. They're taught to say, I'm sowing into my harvest. The desire remains the same, but the language changes its moral meaning. And once the language changes, the restraint disappears, caution becomes doubt, contentment becomes small thinking, evidence becomes negativity, financial boundaries become fear, criticism becomes persecution, accountability becomes touching the Lord's anointed. The system doesn't just tell people what to believe, it rearranges the moral categories around belief so that the most reasonable questions start to feel spiritually dangerous. That's how financial greed can become a mandatory spiritual duty. The follower is not simply invited to pursue prosperity, they're pressured to prove they believe prosperity belongs to them. They're told that expecting more is faith, speaking more is faith, giving more is definitely faith, and refusing to accept ordinary limitations is faith. At that point, the doctrine has fused desire, identity, and obedience into one psychological package. And this is what makes the system so hard to challenge. You're not only asking someone to reconsider a doctrine, you're asking them to reconsider the version of themselves that doctrine created, the favored one, the chosen one, the one with authority, the one whose words have power, the one who's not supposed to be broke, sick, ordinary, delayed, denied, or disappointed. Word of faith doesn't just promise people things, it gives them a spiritually inflated sense of self and then charges them money to maintain it. That's divine entitlement. It's the belief that reality should bend because faith has been performed correctly. And once people accept that framework, exploitation becomes easier to disguise because every demand can be framed as activation. Give to activate, speak to activate, silence your doubt to activate, ignore the evidence. When nothing changes, the doctrine survives by claiming the person did not activate it the right way. So now the scam is not only external, it's moved inside the person's operating system. Reality is no longer something to study, adapt to, or engage honestly. Reality becomes something to override. And the more reality refuses to cooperate, the more the believer is pressured to double down on the very system that failed them. The mechanics of spiritualized certainty begin with the belief that language does not merely describe reality, but controls it. Once Word of Faith teaches people that their words have creative force, speech stops being communication and becomes spiritual technology. You're no longer just saying what you think or naming what you feel. You're either activating blessing or sabotaging your future. This is why positive confession becomes so powerful. It trains people to monitor their own language as if every honest sentence might become a curse. At first, this can sound empowering. Speak life, stay positive, don't let fear control your mouth. And in ordinary life, there is value in not letting despair become your only vocabulary. But Word of Faith takes that basic insight and turns it into a trap. It doesn't simply encourage people to be hopeful, it makes honesty dangerous. You can't say you're sick because that might be a negative confession. You can't admit that you're struggling financially because that might block your breakthrough. You can't question the doctrine because doubt might cancel the promise. So the person learns to perform confidence even when reality is falling apart. That performance becomes social pressure. In these environments, certainty is rewarded and doubt is punished. The person who says, I'm believing God for increase sounds faithful. The person who says, I gave, I prayed, I confessed, and nothing changed, well, they sound negative. The person who testifies about a breakthrough is celebrated. The person who asks why so many people are still broke after years of sowing seeds becomes a problem. So the community starts selecting for stories that protect the system and silencing the stories that expose it. And that doesn't just happen in religious communities. This is where positive confession becomes a linguistic shield against critical thinking. It blocks the most important questions before they can fully form. Does this actually work? Where is the evidence? Who benefits from this? Why does the failure always belong to the follower and never to the doctrine? Those questions don't get answered because the system teaches people to experience the questions themselves as spiritual threats. Thinking critically starts to feel like speaking death. Observing reality starts to feel like doubt. Naming harm starts to feel like rebellion. And when reality keeps refusing to match the confession, cognitive dissonance takes over. The person has to explain the gap between what they were promised and what actually happened. But because the doctrine has already been protected from scrutiny, the failure cannot be placed on the system. So it turns inward. Maybe I didn't believe hard enough. Maybe I spoke the wrong words. Maybe I had hidden doubt, or maybe I gave with the wrong motive. Maybe I stopped too soon. The mind tries to resolve the contradiction by blaming the self. That's the real danger of spiritualized certainty. It doesn't merely make people overconfident, It makes them afraid of their own perception. They can see the bills, they can feel the sickness, they can notice the pattern, they can watch the leader prosper while the followers struggle, but they've been trained to distrust anything that contradicts the confession. So instead of reality correcting the belief starts to edit reality. And once belief starts editing reality, manipulation becomes much easier to maintain. The doctrine doesn't need to deliver consistent results as long as it can control the interpretation of failure. If the promise works, the system takes credit. If the promise fails, the follower takes blame. Positive confession keeps the machine running by making certainty feel righteous, doubt feel dangerous, and honesty feel like betrayal. And that's how language becomes a cage while still sounding like liberation. The casino logic of seed faith is where the doctrine becomes openly financial. Once people are taught that words can activate reality, giving becomes the next logical step. Now the believer is not just asked to believe something or confess something, they're asked to put some money on it. But the money is not presented as money, it's presented as a seed. That language matters because a donation is something you give to support a cause, but a seed is something you expect to multiply. So the preacher is not simply saying, support this ministry. The preacher is saying, this is how you unlock your harvest. And they're literally saying it. Giving becomes an investment, and the expected return is protected by divine language. That's why seed faith functions so much like gambling. The person risks something real for the possibility of a life changing return. The odds are never stated, the failure rate is never measured, the testimonies are selectively displayed, the winners are celebrated, the people who lost money are told to keep believing, and just like a casino, the system survives because the occasional success story keeps everyone else emotionally invested in the idea that it's their turn next. The house always wins. The promise of a hundredfold return is especially dangerous because it wraps high risk financial speculation in sacred authority. In any other setting, if someone told struggling people, give me your rent money and you might get 100 times more back, we would recognize the predation immediately. But when the same pressure is surrounded by scripture, worship music, prophecy, and urgency, the risk starts to feel righteous. And when the harvest doesn't come, the system still protects itself. Well, maybe you doubted. Maybe you spoke against the seed. Maybe you gave with the wrong motive. So the failure of the last seed becomes the reason to sow another one. That's not just theology, that's sunk cost. That's intermittent reinforcement. That's the same psychological loop that keeps people pulling slot machines, chasing bad investments, and believing the next attempt will finally be the one. And now this logic has moved beyond the old televangelist model. In 2026, it may not come through a pulpit and a televised offering appeal. It may come through faith based influencers, prophetic coaches, kingdom wealth courses, manifestation content with Christian language, or hustle gurus telling young people that abundance is one declaration and, of course, one investment away. The packaging changed, but the pressure point stayed the same. That's the scam. The seed is real, the sacrifice is real, the withdrawal is real, but the harvest is always just spiritual enough to avoid accountability and just material enough to keep people paying for it. Now, neurological traps matter because manipulation does not usually work by defeating intelligence. It works by overwhelming the conditions intelligence needs in order to function well. People make better decisions when they're calm, grounded, informed, and able to think through consequences. But high pressure religious environments are often designed to move people out of that state. The music is swelling, the crowd is responding, the preacher is escalating, the testimony is emotional, the appeal is urgent, the room is filled with expectation. And suddenly, the person is not just thinking about a financial decision, they're feeling fear, hope, guilt, belonging, desperation, and the possibility that this moment might be their one chance to change everything. That's why these appeals are so effective. They don't simply present an argument, they create an atmosphere. And in that atmosphere, the brain is not calmly weighing evidence, it's responding to emotional intensity, social pressure, and perceived urgency. When someone is already under stress, grieving a loss, facing a medical crisis, behind on bills, worried about their children, or trying to rebuild their life, the promise of supernatural intervention can feel like a lifeline. The more desperate the situation, the more powerful and palatable the promise becomes. Predatory leaders understand this, whether they explain it in clinical language or not. They know when people are most reachable. They know people are vulnerable after transitions, whether that be a move, whether that be a public failure, financial collapse, or during that quiet season when someone is trying to believe their life can still become something better. So the message is timed to the wound. This is your season. Your breakthrough is close. Don't miss this moment. God is asking for your obedience right now. Urgency becomes the tool that keeps people from slowing down long enough to ask better questions. And when the promised breakthrough doesn't come, the damage doesn't end with the money loss. The person is left with a psychological wound. They may feel ashamed for believing, they may feel foolish for giving, they may feel angry at themselves for ignoring the red flags. And if they're still inside the system, they may be told their pain is proof that they failed spiritually. So now they're not just dealing with disappointment, they're dealing with religious trauma, the collapse of trust, the fear of being deceived again, the guilt of questioning, and the grief of realizing that what they called faith may have been manipulation. That's what makes this kind of exploitation so cruel. It doesn't only drain resources, it can damage a person's relationship with their own mind. They may struggle to trust their instincts. They may second guess their ability to discern reality. They may associate hope with danger because hope was used against them. And for people leaving these systems, the recovery is not just financial, it's emotional, psychological, and sometimes communal. They have to rebuild the ability to ask questions without guilt, set boundaries without fear, and recognize that disappointment is not evidence that they failed some invisible spiritual test. So when we talk about neurological traps, we're not saying people are helpless machines. We're saying that human beings are influenceable, especially under pressure. And any environment that combines emotional intensity, spiritual authority, financial urgency, and social reinforcement should be examined carefully. Because if a message requires people to be overwhelmed before they obey, that's not transformation. That's manipulation wearing the costume of a miracle. So, breaking the cycle begins when you stop asking, do I have enough faith to receive this? And start asking, who's asking me to ignore reality and who benefits if I do? That one question can interrupt the whole machine because manipulation depends on urgency, confusion, shame, and emotional pressure. It needs you to move before you think. It needs you to give before you calculate. It needs you to obey before you investigate. So, the first act of reclaiming agency is slowing the moment down. Any message, spiritual or secular, that punishes you for asking reasonable questions deserves suspicion. If you're told that caution is fear, discernment is doubt, boundaries are rebellion, or financial responsibility is a lack of faith, that's not wisdom. It's control. Healthy communities can withstand questions. Honest leaders can explain where the money goes. Real support does not require you to abandon your judgment. If the only way the message works is by making you feel guilty for thinking clearly, the problem is not your lack of faith. The problem is the pressure being applied to your mind. This is where discernment has to become practical. Before you give money, ask what is being promised. Is this a donation or are you being sold a return? Is the appeal based on need or is it based on fear? Are you being invited to support work you believe in or pressured to prove your obedience? Are testimonies being used as evidence while failures are hidden? Are people allowed to say, I gave and nothing happened without being shamed? If the system celebrates the wins but spiritualizes the losses, it's not accountable, it's rigged. Reclaiming agency also means separating your worth from your financial condition. You are not more favored because you are rich, and you are not spiritually defective because you are struggling. Poverty is not proof of failed faith. Debt is not proof of weak character. Sickness is not proof that you spoke the wrong words. Life is complicated. Systems matter. Timing matters. Access matters. Opportunity matters. Policy, community matters. And any doctrine that reduces all of that complexity down to your individual faith performance is not empowering you, it is isolating you. A healthier framework starts with evidence based reality. What is actually happening? What can be verified? What pattern keeps repeating? Who is gaining power, money, or influence? Who is absorbing the risk? What happens when the promise fails? Those questions don't make you negative. They make you responsible. They help you return to reality after being trained to override it. And that's the real freedom on the other side of this. Not becoming cynical, not losing the ability to hope, not mocking everyone who still believes differently. The freedom is learning how to protect your hope from people who know how to monetize it. Hope is too sacred to hand over to every person with a microphone, a prophecy, a payment link, and a promise of overflow. So, breaking the cycle is not just walking away from a doctrine, it is rebuilding trust with yourself. It is learning to ask questions without shame. It is learning to set boundaries without guilt. It is learning to support community without surrendering your discernment. It is learning that your life does not need to be explained by a failed formula. Because if a system has to make you afraid of your own questions, suspicious of your own perception, and ashamed of your own reality, it's not delivering you, it's managing you. If this conversation helped you name something you experienced, I don't want you to just leave with information. I want you to know that there is a community being built for people and by people who are trying to rebuild life beyond manipulation. Bridge City is for people who want belonging without the coercion, community without superstition, and support without surrendering their critical thinking. So if you're looking for a soft place to land and a safe space to live, tap into Bridge City today. And if you believe this kind of work needs to exist, you can help us build it by becoming a Patreon supporter, a YouTube member, or a PayPal donor. Not because I'm promising you a hundredfold return, not because your blessing is on the other side of it, but because real community takes real support. And we're building something for people who were told that they had nowhere else to go. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, keep rising.